Welcome to Coffee with Catholic Workers, a podcast from and about folks involved in the Catholic worker movement. I'm Theo.
And I'm Lydia. We've both been active in the Catholic Worker for the past decade, and we're really excited to introduce you to some of our favorite people from the movement.
In today's episode, we're talking to Catherine Morris, who lives at the Hennessy House of Hospitality in Los Angeles. I was actually lucky enough to work and live in community with Catherine for 7 years out there in LA. In this interview, she tells us about when she felt the call to leave her life as part of a religious order, running a school for well-to-do students, and join up with the Catholic worker movement instead. She then talks about her and the LA workers' support for the United Farm Workers and how that led her to jail with Dorothy Day. Finally, she talks about some advice for folks thinking about possibly making a life of the Catholic worker movement.
All right, let's get to it.
Well, Catherine, welcome to Coffee with Catholic Workers. We're so happy you were willing to join us and talk about your time at the LA Catholic Worker. We've been starting most of these talks with asking folks, how did you find your way to the Catholic worker movement?
Well, I found my way to the Catholic worker movement through the Catholic Agitator. I had gone to Catholic schools through 12th grade, but I didn't know anything about the Catholic worker. And after I finished college, I taught for a while, and at the age of 26 entered a religious order. And we used to go to the American Friends Service Committee bookstore. And lo and behold, the Catholic Agitator was there on a shelf, and someone brought it home to me. And so it was my introduction to the movement. And on it, it said that they had Mass at the Hennessy House every Sunday morning. And so another sister and I went to Mass, and that would be on Cumming Street, the original Hennessy House. And that's how I got in touch with the people who were there then. That would be Kristen Dan Delaney, Jeff Dietrich, and a couple of others. And then I went down to the kitchen at the request of one of the other sisters who had been working at the kitchen, but I didn't know that. She was going on vacation and said they were shorthanded. Would I fill in? So I went down, and this little sequence of events happened to coincide with my thinking. I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing. I was involved in a very upscale school, and all of the young people there were very wealthy. And I thought, why am I busting my butt when they already have everything they want? And so I just sort of fell in love with the people down on Skid Row. And that love has continued now for 50 years. And so it was through a connection that brought me to the kitchen and introduced me to the people there on Skid Row that made me hook up with the Catholic worker.
And so that process involved leaving the religious order. What was that like to make that sort of decision?
An interesting part is that when I said I don't want to work here anymore, it came at just a little window of time when instead of saying what they had been saying, they said, why don't you, which was leave, why don't you check out and see if there's something else that you want to do? And so for a year, I did a variety of things. I worked for the United Farm Workers, and I taught at the Los Angeles County Hospitals Education Office. I worked in a little well baby, well, it's not little, it seemed like a zillion babies, a well baby clinic in East LA, and a couple of other things. And I did that for a year. And that included working at the kitchen a couple of days a week. At the end of that year, the superiors said, "You seem very attracted to the Catholic worker." I agreed. And they assigned me to the Catholic worker as my year's work. And so for a year, I was living with the sisters and working with the Catholic worker. And then, as luck would have it, Jeff and I became more than friends, and we decided to get married. So it's at that point that I left the community and moved into Catholic work. That's sort of the whole story of how I got here.
You mentioned in there that you spent some time working with the United Farm Workers. That ended up being a project that the LA Worker generally was supporting at that time in the 70s, right?
Very much so. And in fact, I had started working on boycotts and other events that the union was having here locally while I was still with the sisters. And that was actually part of coming to the realization that I was probably not in the right place, because I would go out and work with the union and then come back, and I had been given the use of a little Fiat. I would leave the materials in the car. And one morning we went out to the front of the giant lawns in front of the school, and they were littered with leaflets from the United Farm Workers. And it became very clear that some of the families were related to the industry, the agriculture industry, and they thought it was pretty outrageous that I would be working with the United Farm Workers. So that was part of my realization that there's two Americas and that I was in the wrong one. And so I decided it was time to move to the other America. And I just happened to move from one place to the other that also worked for the United Farm Workers. And so I continued working that first year when the sisters assigned me to the Catholic worker, that I also continued working with the farm workers and kind of ran an office for them in Pasadena. They didn't have an office in Pasadena, and there was a proposition on the ballot at that time. And so I worked in Pasadena doing the work that regional offices were doing, but I wasn't one of the $5 a week people. I was doing it as a volunteer, full-time volunteer. And so then, let's see, I'm kind of mixing up two stories, I think. But in 1973, there was a big strike in the Central Valley. And at that same time, the Jesuits were having a Ignatian Symposium in San Francisco. And they were getting some heat for being an all-male event. And so they opened it up to having some women, religious, be responders to the papers being presented. So I was invited to respond to the paper on poverty. So what it meant, though, was the event was 2 weeks long. And even though I was only going to speak for 10 minutes, I had to be there for the whole time. So I met a couple of the Jesuits who were like-minded. And when it came time to have the big splash of celebration of St. Ignatius Day, they wanted to have an alternative event. And the alternative event was to rent buses and to go down to the strike area. So I helped organize that. And the night before Ignatian's feast, we got on the buses. There were 2 buses, one for the priests and one for the nuns. And we went down and got there just before sunrise. And so the in-charge priest said, we're here to do whatever Caesar wants done. And they said, well, right now we're going to have mass. So they threw a Union flag over the picnic table and set up for mass. And then when mass was over, the Jesuits were saying, well, we need to get going here. They said, what would you like us to do? And they said, well, we want you out on the picket line. And you are putting yourself at risk for being arrested, because up to that point, everybody else had been arrested the days before. And so then they started looking at their watches and saying when their planes were and so forth. And so Chris Hartmeyer, who was the in-charge person, said, well, we can't spend any more time on this. Those of you who stand for justice, go to the right. And those of you who don't, and the rest of you go to the left. And so you had to quickly decide if you were the people who stood for justice or part of the rest. And so there was one other sister with me, and we looked at each other and said, oh, shit, and went and stood with the people who stood for justice. And then they got us in buses and out to this picket line. And we had just gotten there and kind of gotten a sense of, this is in Parlier in Central Valley. And my favorite fruit is nectarines. And this was a nectarine grove. And so we were given our signs and our places on the picket line. And the police were already there. The police buses were already there. And we weren't on that picket line for very long before we were in those buses. And by then, the Fresno county jails were already full. So they took us to a farm where the inmates grew vegetables for the meals to be served. And so we were in dormitories at this industrial farm. And the next day, we were taken to court in the same old buses. And when we were standing in line waiting to go into court, someone said, there's Dorothy Day. And she had just been arrested the next morning. And they had her sitting down. And this was just after the rather famous picture of her looking up at the policemen with their guns at their side. That had been taken, and then she had been brought into Fresno. And embarrassing part of the story is I got out of line and went over and said, Dorothy, it's Catherine Morris from the LA house. And she had her hand up shading from the sun, and she said, who are you? So I didn't make any impression whatsoever on Dorothy at that moment. But we did spend a couple of weeks in jail, and we were in adjoining barracks. And so she would come out to the fence and tell somebody to ask me to come out, and we would talk. And so I think this might be in The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, the book by her granddaughter. Anyway, she said, what order are you in, sister? And I said, I'm a sister of the Holy Child. She said, oh, the rich sisters. You've put my daughter out of school. And that was mighty embarrassing. But what saved my my reputation, let's say, was that the next day, 8 more Sisters of the Holy Child were arrested. And And so we had the most sisters of all, and she was pretty impressed by that. So anyway, while she was in jail there, all the wives of the growers wanted to set her straight, why their husbands were right and the union was wrong. And the thing was that they didn't have anything. There were hundreds of people in jail by then, and they didn't have anything for us to do. So they just let there be all day long visiting in an auditorium. And if you knew someone's name, they would bring that person up. If you didn't know anyone, you just wanted to talk to one of the inmates, they brought anybody up. But everybody knew Dorothy's name, so she got brought up a lot. And she was exhausted and finally had to ask not to be brought up anymore. At the end of that time, an attorney friend of one of the arrestees said, "This is not right. I'll take you into court as a class action." And he got everybody out by 8 p.m. that night. So they were just pushing us out the door. And Dorothy came at that point, then came down to our house and rested for a week because her mode of travel was buses, and she was just too weak and tired to go immediately home. So she stayed at the house for a week, and they would call every day and say, "Have you sent your article yet, Dorothy?" And she loved to tell stories, so she would go upstairs to write, and then she'd come down for coffee. But if there was anyone around, she would start talking again. Then we'd get another call. "Have you sent your story yet, Dorothy?" Well, the pathetic thing is that when she finally did get on the bus and leave, she left all her materials at the house, and we had to ship them. So anyway, that's just an aside of a very important part in my life to spend that much time with her, and that was very much related to the Catholic worker working with the United Farm Workers. So for years we would go after Saturday kitchen. We had our own store that they designated for us to cover. And so we would finish, clean up, and go, and then work every Saturday with the union, and go to any rallies they were having. And so it was very, very much a part of the resistance work of the community at that time.
I'm just curious to clarify. You said the LA worker was assigned a specific store by the UFW. Was this during one of their big boycotts? Were you is that what you all were doing at your store?
That was left out the name. We had our own Safeway. They were boycotting Safeway, and usually their boycotts would be against a product, but when they switched over at one point, they were doing all kinds of price checking and all kinds of things that I didn't understand, but I was doing them in Safeway stores. And I believe that's called a secondary boycott. And so we had this Safeway store on 3rd Street, and it had a giant parking lot. And on Saturdays, everybody's doing their weekend shopping. And so when we would get there, it would be maybe 2 p.m, and there would be lots and lots of cars. I wasn't very good at it because it meant going up to the drivers and trying to get them before they got out of the car and ask them to go to some other store. And at that time, I could say what stores were nearby. And someone else that was on our team, so to speak. He was an Episcopal priest. Or no, he became an Episcopal priest. He was one of the union workers at that time, and he didn't let anybody get out of their car. He'd have them out of that parking lot in no time, and I'd be back thinking, oh, they have a cane. I don't think I want to ask them to go something. And I just wasn't good at it. Jeff was really good at it, and so was our friend. But anyway, so that's what it was. It was a secondary boycott.
Yeah, when you talk about resistance work for people who are maybe newer to the idea of the Catholic worker, what are the sort of things you mean by that, by resistance?
When I use that, I'm speaking collectively of all of the efforts we make to address the issues in the society that do not bring the people who have the greatest need a voice. And so that's one way of looking at it anyway. And so the LA Worker has quite a history of resistance campaigns, and some of them are such as the working with the United Farm Workers, and a great deal of them are anti-nuclear. And so when we go out to the test site or to the drone station out in the desert, we are raising the voice of the people, saying no. Now we know we're not raising the voice of all the people, but we are trying to turn around what is causing the poverty and the inequality of resources and so forth of the government in how they spend the tax money that comes from the people, but goes to making war, preparations for war, making new weapons, and so forth. And then on a local level, we are forever addressing the lack of housing for the 60,000 people who are on the streets here and the sidewalks. And right now there's a lot of scandal in Los Angeles city government, and so we quickly make signs to address that, and go down to City Hall and rattle their cages. And so that is how I'm using the term resistance. That sometimes it's related to local issues, sometimes international, and so forth.
So the LA Worker has a very long history of work, the oldest Catholic workers. What does it look like today? What's a day-to-day typical life in the LA Worker look like?
Well, the LA Worker is looking very different at the present time. We are in one of our smaller modes. We've been as large as 28 in the community, and right now we're 5, and if you include Jeff and Catherine, 7. And I say that because Jeff has actually said he's retired, but now he's refired because both of us are working every day at the kitchen. And so the kitchen is open on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And it looks very different because since the pandemic, we serve boxed lunches. And during the most difficult part of the pandemic, the garden was closed. And so people just got their box lunches and moved on. Now the garden is reopened and people can get their lunches, their box lunches, and go either leave or eat in the garden. So that's very different. And then on Sunday morning, we serve coffee and a very light breakfast, like a coffee cake and an egg, sometimes fruit that's still around from this lunch service, and and then on Fridays, the at the garden, um, there's a foot care project. We call it the foot care clinic, but it's outdoors, and the building that's still called a clinic because for a lot of years, I think something like 17 years, we had a free clinic that was fully staffed by doctors, etc. We finally had to close it, not because we couldn't afford it, we had figured that out, but because people were coming from as far away as Mexico to access our little clinic, and they were getting all the appointments, and the street people for whom we had the clinic were getting turned away. So we tried for a whole year a variety of ways of keeping it as a neighborhood clinic, but people were smarter than we were, and finally we had to close it because it was we were not able to keep it to its clientele that we had in mind. And so um, all the time that we had the clinic, the 17 years, the room I'm sitting in right now was a at home uh, clinic room where people's legs and arms and bodies could recover. So that was an important part of past work. But now it is open during our lunch service time as a service desk. And so what's available is over the counter meds and toiletries and just about everything else. And that you would find in a CVS or a Walgreens or something, because Anne Bowden is a magic woman who has turned a tiny little aspirin operation into a full-on store. So that's open during the lunches. And then there's right now the work in the resistance, use that word again, uh, is the city's plan to make Skid Row even smaller. They already have done some of that. And there's kind of a history to this because years back, Los Angeles was going to adopt the Philadelphia plan, which was referred to as the Silver Book. And I read an article in the newspaper about the Silver Book, and it didn't sound good to me. And that they were having a meeting and that there would be public response. So I told Jeff he ought to go, but he was already going to something else. So I went. And at the end, I did get up and speak against the plan, which was really going to knock down the existing services in a very destructive way to the people. But I was kind of anxious about speaking in front of all these people in suits, and so my voice was quivering, and I was very close to tears. And so I finished up and went and sat down, and the place got really quiet. Then these three men stood up and all came over because they wanted to be in on knocking down this plan, but they had to have a client. So it sounded like a client to them. So anyway, I was just the kickoff person because I went home, told Jeff that it was in his hands now. And it's a fun story because we brought Leonard Blumberg out from Temple University I don't know how we managed that because it was at a time when we really didn't have any money, so we weren't flying people around. But these other people for whom we were a client probably took care of that. And with his help and with all their knowledge from other organizations, um, they created a plan for the Skid Row's redevelopment and put it together with a blue, it was just mimeographed. No, not mimeographed. What is it called? Xeroxed, and it had a blue paper on top, so it was called the Blue Book. And so then they had this great plan to knock down the Silver Book. Only they were the only ones that knew it, and it just so happened that someone that was working with them knew someone who worked in City Hall. So he thought that when the city council was on lunch break, he could go in and put the Blue Book at their places, which he did. And so then they came in back from lunch and they're all picking this up. Where'd this come from? What's this? And so forth. And uh, actually, the Blue Book was adopted by the city. But now uh, they have found lots of ways of getting around those plans in some areas. And so now there is a group of people, which includes at least Matt, maybe Susan from the house here, go to all the meetings and all. And now there's a green book. And so anyway, we're actually part of uh, taking part in city planning uh, from the heart position. Not that we knew all about it, but it sure felt for the people who live on Skid Row. Now I forgot the question. Did I answer it?
I think so. Just of talking about what are some of the things that are happening
Oh, what
now
we're doing now, right?
at the worker.
And as far as our house where I'm sitting, um, we are 2 miles from the kitchen, and so we have two locations. And in days gone past, um, the kitchen was a two-story building, and it was a 14-room floor of a hotel, and we had part of the community and guests living there as well as here. Now we have just the house here and a one-story kitchen, and our guests are. I was thinking of what Joanne was saying, that they have long-term guests, and she noted some years, and it sort of sounded like us, right, Theo? Uh, because we don't know exactly how long Porfirio has lived here, but it's probably about 30 years. And then we have a couple of people who have been here for over 20 years and so forth. So we've gone through a variety of models of hospitality, but now we are working with long-term guests here at the house. I'm sure I left some stuff out, but that gives you an idea.
It's always hard to cover all of the many things the LA worker does whenever I'm traveling and telling folks about it, because there's all these big things, but there's all these other smaller projects that are really great too, that it's hard to mention them all.
Yeah.
One thing a lot of people admire about the LA worker when I'm talking to them as I go around to different Catholic workers is they'll bring up the shopping carts that
Yes. Well,
worker
we
gives
just
out.
right. We just got a new load of them, and uh, we started this back in the 90s. I'm not sure which 90 what. We started the shopping carts, and it was just a suggestion by someone who was showing us his film. He was a filmmaker, and he had done a film of the homeless in Santa Monica. And he said, what would be a big help to these people is if they had shopping carts. And then he turns to Jeff and says, "Why don't you get shopping carts for the people?" Well, that's all Jeff needs. And so we started buying them 100 at a time. And it's an expensive project because the right behind us giving out the shopping carts is the city of Los Angeles, who is taking them and destroying them. And so people always uh, have their shopping cart for a while, and then they come and say they need a shopping cart, and we say we just got one, but the city took it, and so forth. So anyway, it's been a blessing to a lot of people, and now they've always been said the first 100 were black and brand new, but we couldn't keep that up because they were really expensive. And so we found a company that buys the whole batch from a store and rehabs them, and we would buy those, and they were always red. Now that we lost that contact, so just a week ago, a delivery of another 100 came in, and I think they said there might be from Costco or someplace like that. They're metal, they're way bigger, and we'll see how it goes. But anyway, it's a tremendous help. When we first started it, we thought of it just as a way of having your stuff, or if you were a recycler, and those were what we thought of as the two uses. But now, because of the way the city does street cleaning, they have to take all their stuff, take their tents down, take all the stuff out of the tents. And if they have a cart, they can put it all mostly together and wheel it to an area outside the cleaning district of that day. So anyway, yes, we have been doing that, and we're still continuing it, but it's price tag went way up, so we can't get those rehabbed plastic ones anymore. And something that is really important to me is that during the AIDS pandemic, or whatever, I've forgotten how they named it, we started a project at the county hospital on an evening clinic, where we took we took food and drinks, coffee and so forth, and met a lot of people, and many of them had been absolutely discarded by their families, and so many of them over the years came to live and die here at the Hennessy House. And so um, we had a lot of people who we had some people that we could reconnect to their families, but more people who uh, we became their power of attorney, and they died with us. And so there are um, 20 graves in our memorial garden, and 6 graves at the kitchen in the garden there. And it's just for we just had the Day of the Dead, and it's a very, very important um, feast for me because I knew all these people, and we have their cremains right here in our gardens.
With the length of time of being at the LA Worker, I imagine that you could have just stories for days of the different initiatives or the people and the lives and deaths that have all been touched or influenced by. In your years there, do you have sort of words of advice for people who are starting out in the Catholic Worker, or especially for people who are considering? I mean, there's people who sort of pass through the worker period of time, and there's other people who consider making it their life work. Any words of advice that you would have for people who are thinking, is this something I want to dedicate a life to?
Right. The way I look at that is, even now, I'm in year 51. Even now, I only commit for a year, and I don't know who can, well, we've had people come to the front door, they've read about Dorothy and they're here and they're going to be here for the rest of their lives. And that usually means maybe a week, maybe less. So you have to dig in and find out how much you can take and how much you can give. And so with Jeff and I often, when I'm asked to, it's not the answer I give, but it's what runs through my mind arriving at what I can give as an answer. And that is that I don't think I could have made the commitment and actually spent 50 years here if it weren't as a couple. And I don't mean that you have to be married, a married couple. I mean a couple of people that it just seems to me that it would be way too hard to keep going if you didn't have someone to lean on as you went along. And so now to back up to the actual question, oftentimes I've been asked, so how do you start a Catholic worker? And my answer usually annoys people because I say, you just start. And then they want to know what that means. And and they say, well, you've got the idea, and you have to think about where you think you can stick that idea, and then find out what you could do in that spot that you're thinking about, and then start doing it. And if it doesn't work, but you still like the spot, you try something else. And start a journal. Yes, start a journal. If I had one thing to do different than we'd have over the years, is that we never started a journal. And so it's really hard, someone comes up with a really good idea, and you, over the 50 years that have gone by, you've already tried that twice. Do we really want to do it again? But the person having the idea uh, might get the picture if they saw it in writing. And so and then I'm often asked, when did we such and such? And I don't know, but that my answer is, well, if we just had a journal, we could look it up. And so anyway, start small, hang in there, try something. If it doesn't work, it's probably not the right decision. Try something else, but keep trying. And if you have the desire to work for justice and to make a contribution, that doesn't mean you run for office or something like that. It means that you make a difference in at least one life. But as a Catholic worker, you have the opportunity of making a difference in a lot of lives, and in simple ways. I am not fully employed at the kitchen anymore. I serve the water, and I have a little corner of the table with stuff on it. And I watch to see what people really seem to like that I'm putting out to give away. And you learn so much as you go along of what it means to live simply. They're living beyond simply. They are living poverty. And and we're now, Jeff and I are buying pens at the 99-cent store because I've scooped up all the pens around the house and put them out, and people are so excited just to get a pen. And so uh, if you are excited by the fact that you can meet simple unbelievably simple needs for people, you might consider becoming a Catholic worker.
Well, thanks, Catherine, for taking the time to meet today. We really appreciate hearing your story and you being share for other people.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. And I heard Joanne appreciate her appreciation of what you're doing, and I would second that.
Wonderful.
The pleasure is ours.
Great. And if you're in the neighborhood, do stop by.
All right. Well, it was really a lot of fun to talk with Catherine, and I really loved and appreciated the passion that Catherine really brought to the conversation. You can hear the ways that she really cares deeply for all she interacts with. I think you can hear in those stories this deep feelings of joy that comes from being in and at the Catholic Worker, but then also in some of those stories, this deep sorrow or pain that also comes along with it.
Yeah, Catherine just celebrated her 50th anniversary as a Catholic worker. And I was really thinking about, she mentioned currently there's a fight over rezoning Skid Row and how they've already had to fight that fight in the past. It's probably tough to have these problems recurring every so often. Sometimes you get a win and then you just have to come back to the same fight later on.
Yeah, I'm sure we are just scratching the surface of the very many stories that she has. It does seem that there are times this cyclical nature of things. Of she had sort of mentioned, this idea of keeping a journal to keep track of the things that have already been tried or the hopefully ways that we can learn from errors that have happened before or struggles that have happened before. But I even think of just like the cyclical nature of life that she talks of. Right? People live and then they die, and that's sort of the rhythm of things. And being able to share in that rhythm with people in the worker in both the life and death in the struggle of fighting these fights again and again, and the celebrations of the times when sometimes there's a win.
I've been really bad about keeping that journal part of things. I think about it a whole lot, and I've often made a start, but I'll like record one thing, and then 3 weeks will pass before I put in my next entry, and then it'll be 5 weeks before another. Uh, but it's definitely, I think, worth doing. A lot of folks find inspiration from Dorothy Day's journals and stuff like that, and she did it dutifully, even talking about really basic things like what they ate for dinner and stuff like that.
Yeah, our house does not have a journal. We do have a poster that records key moments of, when people have come and gone. But things like when we had the infestation of rats, or when we joined in different protests or activism. Perhaps not quite the kind of journal Catherine was referencing, but at least a marker of time of some.
But that's all part of doing the Catholic worker thing, I think. Not every day are you going to jail with Dorothy Day. There's a lot of days where you're just trying to deal with the rat infestation.
Right. And as far as I know, we do not have any rats currently. Mice maybe, but no rats.
Let's knock on wood about that.
That wraps up another episode of Coffee with Catholic Workers. We'd like to thank Chris from the Bloomington Catholic Worker with help with our editing, and David Hayes for our music.
Thanks for joining us again for some clarification of thought. We hope today's conversation and discussions have been enlightening, and maybe even that you're encouraged to go out and help build a world where it's easier to be good.